Good to have you with us. My name is Jens Hilke. I'm a conservation planner with Vermont Fish and Wildlife Department, and you're joining the conversation on Forest Matter, land use planning for forest integrity. Also with us, and I'll ask you to introduce yourself. Keith, would you please introduce yourself?
Sure. Hey, my name is Keith Thompson. I'm the Private Lands Program Manager with Department of Forest, Parks, and Recreation.
Great, and it's such a pleasure to have you with us for this conversation, Keith. Thanks for doing it. And also with us today, helping on the back end, is Lincoln. Would you introduce yourself?
Sure. I'm Lincoln Frasca, based out of Montpelier, and I work with Jens in the Community Wildlife Program with Vermont Fish and Wildlife Department.
Great. And so the plan for the next hour is we really just want to have a conversation and just talk a little bit about forests and why they matter, and then we'll intersperse with that a video series that Agency of Natural Resources has produced with Peregrine Productions called Forest Matter. And it's really getting at this idea of land use planning for forest integrity. But just to start things off, Keith, can you set the scene a little bit in terms of a forest and their importance in Vermont? When you think of forests, tell me the range of things that come to your mind.
The range is huge. There's really not a part of our lives that forests don't touch in one way or another. For much of us, that's kind of touching us individually. Certainly the context in which we live, it affects all parts, from the air that we breathe, the water we drink, the animals that we see and look for when we're out recreating. The economy is largely driven by the forest around us, not just the tourism aspects, but also the products that we harvest, whether it's saw timber or syrup, or so on. And then individually, just the recreational opportunities that we've got across the landscape are fundamental to how we live, our happiness, our health. And that's just for people, and the forest and everything that depends on the forest, the diversity of species that Vermont supports is in a large part a function of the forests and their health and integrity.
Yeah, I'd love to talk a little bit about that you just mentioned the term forest integrity. And I always think of that as something like the opposite of forest fragmentation, having whole forest, intact forest. In my world, in the Fish and Wildlife Department, we talk about forests, wanting our forests to be intact, connected, and diverse as three sort of measures of what makes a forest and forest integrity. But that pattern has changed over time, and I think back, when I was in graduate school, we learned that we were 97% forest pre-white settlement, went down to about 20% forest, and now are back up to 79% forest. But it really depends how you cut it. What can you tell us from your standpoint about forest fragmentation, this idea of big blocks getting smaller and smaller?
Well, I think we can see it in a lot of different scales. As a kid growing up in Waterbury, I used to hike around, and there would be sections of forest that I would just go and go and go. And now along the way, I'm crossing driveways, running into houses, or changing my route to kind of stay in the woods, basically. And that's just a very small segment of that narrow view of my personal view. If we zoom out, that's happening across the landscape. And it's not, I used Waterbury as an example. It's really happening everywhere. And amazing areas of forests are very attractive for folks who want to live in the woods. But as a result, there's a consequence, and those forests get broken up into smaller pieces. And I think, like me, it takes wildlife and other things more work to stay in the woods as they try to stay in their habitat and in their place.
Yeah, that's exactly right. So I'll just set the scene here. The first video we want to show you is the introductory video to this series on forest matter. And it's going to kick off the series, and we'll hear from a lot of different voices, ours included. But maybe I'll just play that right now, and then we can keep the conversation going. See what this video this adds to the conversation. So here we go, and please let me know if this is not playing correctly.
Whatever the question is, forests are the answer. If we're talking about the state's economic vitality, or the state's water quality, or the role the state is playing in climate mitigation, moving forward, forests are a fundamentally defining characteristic of Vermont, and they are really part of what makes us strong.
Intact forests support diverse wildlife.
Trees are really good at maintaining the health of water, the water table and surface waters, and flood resilience.
On the economic side, intact forests mean productive forests, and so we can support forest product industries at the same time as drawing in visitors that, of course, like to look at the fall color, but also to spend time on our trails, recreating in a variety of ways throughout the year.
It's easy to think that because things haven't happened to your forest, they're not going to happen. And that is not the case, unfortunately. We have intense development pressure coming our way.
We are seeing increasing fragmentation of our forests in Vermont. We've been documenting this at Vermont Natural Resources Council.
While we still have a lot of tree cover, our forest pattern has changed from large, continuous, intact blocks to increasingly smaller and smaller blocks.
We know that intact forests are more productive forests. That means maintaining or at least encouraging these large forest blocks to remain the way that they are.
You know, a road in a forest may not seem that big of a deal to you and me. If we were to saw your car in half, well, it's still your car. It's just got this crack in the middle, and we all go, well, then it's not going to work, right?
Act 171 is a response to those changes to try and keep our forests as intact as possible and maintain a landscape pattern of intact forest.
It shines a spotlight on the importance of forests, and it really asks communities to think about identifying these important areas and trying to plan for the integrity of these areas into the future. So in 2018 is when the planning provision went into effect, and since then, as towns revise their town plan, they need to look at this particular provision.
Those variety of different both economic, cultural, and ecological values, I think many towns often maybe not put an emphasis on, but this new requirement has kind of elevated that to ensure people are thinking more deeply about these places that they care about and they have respect for and that they rely on as part of their town's identity.
We're trying to influence the location of development to make sure that we can have development, but also preserve the forest blocks so that they can support a greater diversity of uses.
Towns aren't limited to a certain outcome or implementation measure. There's a lot of flexibility within the Act that allows communities to set forth a vision that really is unique to them.
There's just an amazing wealth of information that's available to municipal groups.
We've seen a doubling of communities that are now addressing these resources. So that's to say that Act 171 is having an important effect in this planning, and we think that's really positive for the state.
From a long-range planning perspective, Act 171 is basically kind of that spark. It's that thing that sets that conversation off.
It's exciting to see this level of effort going into protecting a common resource that really supports the state of Vermont.
The cumulative impact of what each of the towns does in total creates the pattern of Vermont's forests and waters and ultimately our landscape and the type of lifestyle we all get to enjoy.
Neat. You know, every time I hear Kevin Geiger say, like, if we cut your car in half, we'd all agree that's not a car anymore. And I think, oh, that's exactly right. That's exactly what we're talking about with this idea of forest fragmentation. I love that. But you know, the other piece here that video brings up is just like laying the framework for you know, Act 171, and I think what we started talking about before the video was why why is that important? Why do forests matter? Why would, you know, what's the need for this sort of legislation? And I think the video did a really good job of getting into that. And then it brought us into this idea of thinking about the steps in planning and in town planning, and using different resources or the town bringing in different resources to help with that. So you heard a few voices from regional planning commissions, and Kevin Geiger is one. And they're really great resources for towns to use in thinking about these sorts of issues. Another great resource to utilize are our friends at Forest Parks and Recreation, and thinking about the not only county foresters, but also the folks in the Urban Community Forestry Program. Keith, can you tell us a little bit more about those programs in particular, and how towns might utilize that expertise?
Sure. The county foresters provide a real valuable service to private landowners, in particular, really assisting private landowners to navigate how to take care of their land for forestry-related management objectives. They can also really support towns in considering their management of town forests, and at times, broadly, they can be brought in to help consider, you know, what's valuable, what's unique here in our town, and look at it from a kind of third-party perspective, an objective perspective, with a ton of experience traveling throughout these towns and working on the full spectrum of the land base, and often provide unique insight about what opportunities and challenges there might be in managing those forests well. The Urban and Community Forestry Program is really fabulous in supporting towns in the urban and community landscapes, in thinking about street trees, dealing with emerald ash borer is an example. There's a lot of mortality of ash trees right now, and there are a lot of challenges associated with that, and some opportunities. So they can support folks in thinking about how to navigate a plan moving forward, potentially accessing funding to replace some street trees, and supporting road crews and things like folks like them to think about, how do I stay safe while managing and responding to these issues? So that's just a small slice of what the department can help offer in those areas.
Yeah, thanks, Keith. And you know, Lincoln and I are very engaged at the municipal level as well. I coordinate the Community Wildlife Program for Department of Fish and Wildlife, and we're engaged in municipal technical assistance across the state. We serve all 268 municipalities in Vermont. That's right, it's not 251, and all the 11 regional planning commissions. And so we help conservation commissions like Becky, yours in Plainfield. We help conservation commissions and planning commissions with that sort of land use planning. And so sometimes that's just open presentations, and sometimes that's much more in-depth technical assistance relating to a particular town plan rewrite or zoning codes. So, you know, there are a variety of programs. Another one that I'd like to mention is the Rivers program out of the Department of Environmental Conservation. While rivers aren't talking about forests, it's all connected, and these sorts of technical assistance providers can help the town in their planning process to bring the science in as well as some of the other values. So I think over the course of these videos in the next 40 minutes now, you know, we'll talk more about bringing in some more of those different voices. I'm just going to go to the next video and we'll kick it off here.
Really the first step for towns to engage in when thinking about forest integrity is getting a sense of where are their largest forest blocks and where are their connections between those forest blocks. Online mapping tools like BioFinder or the Natural Resource Atlas are really excellent ways for towns to figure out that pattern of forest integrity.
Most of the resources that you need to do this from a background resources perspective already exist. And the help that you can get from Jens and his colleagues is really quite beneficial as well. And that really makes the process a whole lot easier.
The regional planning commissions can do two things. One, they can help synthesize that information, distill down the main points that your town needs to care about, and they can put it in context for where your town fits with other towns, right? What are other towns trying in terms of zoning to address forest fragmentation and conversion? What are other towns doing in terms of thinking about connectivity blocks?
We've created a website that actually tracks parcelization or subdivision in Vermont, and you can look at trends both at your community level, regionally. You can look at it across the state and use that kind of information then to inform your planning.
You know, you have Jens at the state level, a whole variety of people who will come and talk to you about what this stuff means and why you should do it.
So the Forest Ecosystem Monitoring Cooperative created forest conversion risk maps to help regional planning commissions, towns understand where on the landscape they might see forest conversion in the future.
Any of our citizens can access this information and use it and be a part of the planning process. They also allow for communication between townspeople because you can create a map of the forest blocks in your town and email it to other members of the Planning Commission or the Conservation Commission.
We used our resources from Agency Natural Resources in a tool called BioFinder. Maps with multiple layers that you can look at things like, you know, wetlands and different kinds of habitat, vegetation.
Forests don't abide by arbitrary lines. They function across those boundaries, across those scales, and while they all matter, we really need to be making sure that we can work at multiple scales and consider the resolution of our work.
Maybe the best thing, at least for me, that we got from the BioFinder website was seeing how Richmond and its pieces add up with our neighboring towns to make some really fantastic places. We know now that we are part of a corridor that wildlife can use to get from the southern greens north to the northern greens. Any one place can be fabulous for wildlife, but to really be rich and to stay that way for generations means we need to be working together.
On the mapping side, it was super helpful that the Regional Planning Commission was involved. So in Chittenden County, the Regional Planning Commission provides mapping and GIS expertise for all of the communities. Their work was essentially free in the sense that they did that work as a function of the dues that we pay as a member municipality. So the project didn't have to bear that cost.
We're seeing shifts in land use and development in a way that we haven't in the past, and so because of that, we need to plan ahead and use these tools to ensure that as that development happens, we don't lose those ecological features that are so important on this landscape.
Great. So that video was about that first step of community assessment, and you know, Brian Voigt made the point that a lot of the resources that towns need are already available online. I spent a lot of time working on the BioFinder website and the Vermont Conservation Design and making those tools available to us. And a lot of that work is helping people to understand what connectivity looks like, how one forest block can line up with another, and what that pattern looks like on the landscape. Just that idea of helping to sort of zoom out from your town and see this larger ecological context is a lot of what we talk about at this sort of community assessment phase, helping to understand that larger context.
Jens, can I jump in? It's so cool to be able to map this and see it from the 30,000 foot level. But as I'm driving around, what does that connectivity look like on the ground? I mean, and why is that a connection versus any other place? What makes something functional?
Yeah, and there are a lot of different types of functional connections between blocks, and it depends. In the more fragmented landscape in the Champlain Valley where I live, even sometimes individual hedgerows can be connections for bobcat, for example. There's this place on 116 right at the where Shelburne Pond, the wetlands of Shelburne Pond comes over. And there's really just a hedgerow there. And we have this bobcat telemetry data, this GPS data, that shows that this bobcat regularly uses this same hedgerow to connect Shelburne Pond up to the foothills of the Green Mountains. So, at the most micro scale, that's a connection. But then, I might be driving up on Jay Peak, and you're on 242, and there's like miles and miles of good quality forest on both sides of the road. And that's certainly a connection too. Yeah.
That's great.
Yeah, and as we think about these connections and both zooming into the individual connection and zooming out, I think a lot about sort of the matrix of lands and who owns what. And so there's not just that sort of ecological context, but there's very much that property context of property. And can you speak a little bit to that?
Yeah, I can, and it's pretty awesome. Most of Vermont is owned by private landowners and individual families, largely that own some land. In many cases, have owned it for a while, and it's their little slice of paradise, and they get to love it and take care of it in the way that that meets their needs, and that's great. And at the same time, in aggregate, we all depend on the forest that they're taking care of for the rest of Vermonters that don't have land or have access to land, and for all of us who are dependent on collectively the wildlife and like I said at the beginning, the economic, social, ecological values that forests provide. So yeah.
I'm going to jump in here because we're just a few minutes behind schedule, and video 30 is coming up soon.
Cool.
Right on. Thanks, Lincoln. I'm just have step 2 video queued up, and so why don't we just jump in on that, and we'll pick up more on the conversation here in a second.
Great. Folks in the community depend on the forest. They depend on the opportunities in the town, whether it's to start a business or to build a home. And those values are all real. And striking the balance between protecting forest resources and supporting the opportunities that help the community thrive, we need to strive to make them compatible. And understanding those needs is a prerequisite to striking that right balance.
The planning process is identifying goals and values and shared commonalities amongst those in your community and with your neighbors. And so it's really important just to hear the voices of everyone and making significant effort to reach out to those that are typically not in the room at your regularly scheduled programs.
But try to identify those places where people are gathering in your community and go out and talk to people about it. And that can be really informal, and it can be a great way to have conversations that aren't necessarily focused on a particular rule or regulation.
We ran a number of events. We did a paddle along the Winooski River with naturalists talking along the way. We had the county forester come and do talks for landowners and how they can manage their land to make it more friendly to wildlife. We had a few classes with school kids. We did a number of videos with our local community TV station. We did a couple bird walks, bike rides, just a number of ways to get people connected.
The first task that we talked about doing was community engagement. And I said, I know I can get at least 10 people there, because I knew 10 people on my road. So I thought, we can do this, right? It's not that hard. And I went literally walking down the road, talking to my neighbors, going, please come. So I had a lot of neighbors who participated, but then we published it on Front Porch Forum. Well, it turns out food is a huge motivator. So we had our first community engagement meeting at Smiley, and I think we had like 100 people come. It was unheard of.
We did do value mapping, and it was a great way to both learn and to bring people together. We all sat down around some huge maps, and people just started circling places that mattered to them. And even on those tables where we had people that did not agree with each other on many things, when they started seeing that they both liked a certain area for the view, or because they went hunting there, or because they like to walk their dog there, they actually started talking together. It was a great chance to learn from everybody and to see what matters to all of us.
Huge forest blocks will get circled in community value mapping as important for a variety of reasons, from economic development like working forests, to recreation, to scenic values or historical values. And so we do see that overlap that comes out very clearly in a lot of the community value mapping exercises that I've been engaged in.
In many places where you're doing work around large forest block habitats, there are not a lot of owners because they're large forest blocks, and they may be very large parcels. And so you may want to talk to those people individually or get them all in a room together. And you can do that through the grand list and go, okay, who are all these parcels out there? So find out what's important to them.
Whenever we do a town plan update, we do surveying of the community, articles in the local paper and Front Porch Forum, posts to just gauge interest and raise awareness about those issues.
Whatever way you can connect with people, because without the connection, there's not going to be any conversation.
I love that. I think Kevin's right on. Without the connection, there's not going to be any conversation. He's so wise. But it's interesting. We heard from a bunch of different people in that last segment about community values and how to understand more about where townspeople are coming from, and just that sort of constant reaching out to others. But I'm really struck that oftentimes not everyone's at the table. In fact, most of the time, it's really the same group of likely suspects that show up at our town meetings. And I think that's one of the biggest challenges. It's not new to forests or thinking about forest integrity. It's been a problem, a difficulty, a challenge, I should say, in our planning work for quite a while. Is how do we engage people, and how do we make sure that we're asking ourselves the question, who's not at the table? And I think that's a big piece here. Keith, maybe I'll just jump right into the next video just to keep us back on time. Did you want to jump? Okay.
In the third step, we want to identify goals and policies to move us forward. And this is no different than what we've been doing for years, having these community discussions about what we want our future to look like and identifying goals and policies that get us there.
It is a real challenging thing to figure out what's right for the town, what's right for the forest as a whole, what's unique about our forests that really deserve protection, but also what are the values and strategies that we really need to support in our forests.
There are a variety of different benefits for a town to recognize the value of their forests and take steps towards maintaining them. Looking at it from a hazard mitigation standpoint, we do have some mountainous areas with some steep valleys. Ensuring that those wooded hillsides are in place can really help slow the flow of any stormwater, rainwater that's coming down through those valleys that ultimately end up in our broad river valleys and have created flooding. Also, the benefits from looking at it from the perspective of ensuring that there are places for people to go out and recreate. A municipality may also own a municipal forest, and that is a great asset to a town, and it does take some conversations about the purpose of that municipal forest, but you could be serving dual purposes as a municipality, being a forest owner, owning your municipal forest, and how you choose to manage that forest. So in thinking about your identified goals and strategies and policies that have been identified through the planning process, it's always good to identify tangible actions and identify actions that you know that are going to be realistic and ones that are within the scope of maybe the Volunteer Planning Commission or other people in town.
We can do something as simple as, in our region, say, well, you can look at our regional plan, and we have a whole series of policies around the forest area. And you can just, basically, regional plans have the same statutory requirements as town plans. You can just take our policies if you want.
So it's not for me as a state employee to decide what the tool is that the towns will use, but there's a whole spectrum of options that towns can choose from. So on the regulatory end, think about the town plan or the zoning or subdivision bylaws. There are tools there that can help regulate the pattern of the landscape.
Also think about those non-regulatory actions that you can undertake. Holding workshops or providing information to people, having walks in the woods.
Providing opportunities for willing landowners to engage with land trusts and do conservation easements. Even land management. Vermonters have been doing good land management for years. That's a critically important piece of maintaining forest integrity across the state.
Often those non-regulatory actions are those ones that can have some great impact.
Forests are central to our way of life and should be central to our land use planning. Policies to move us forward.
Great. So those last two videos were about identifying community values and then identifying community goals. Keith, what's on your mind as you heard those last two? What sorts of things are you thinking about?
I think one of my favorite things is just the spectrum of strategies available to towns, and the regulatory and non-regulatory stuff it's not one or the other. It's using it's a range of tools in the toolbox, and I think that they each satisfy real needs. In some cases, the non-regulatory tools may be necessary to even bring a community to a place where they can consider, if we are going to use these regulatory tools, what might be appropriate. And communities are arriving to this issue from very different places. They've got different histories, different makeup, different needs from the forest, and so I think that communities should really look broadly at what's going to move the needle best in our community, and how do we do it together in a unified way.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. And I'll just bring up this idea that sometimes the most difficult part is actually, or the most overlooked part is really identifying the problem and finding a problem, making clear what the problem is, and getting input from enough people where you can find that area of overlap in their concerns, where they can really say, okay, I can agree that's the problem. I see a lot of towns sort of assume that everybody's on the same page about what the problem is, only to choose a tool, go way down the line, and then realize, oh, wait, we actually don't have consensus on the problem, let alone the solution. So I think that's a piece here. Yeah, over to you.
Yeah, just how do we arrive at that? I mean, that's is that one person pitching, hey, I think this is the problem? Is it what's the strategy for wrestling with that as a community?
I think in our work, it's bringing as many people together to discuss an issue and then agreeing on that problem statement. A lot of times it'll be just the planning commission and they'll say, okay, well, we've got to do this town plan rewrite. Well, actually, there's nothing that says you can't bring in other people. The town of Hartford makes a steering committee for every town every time they do a town plan. And they bring in people from the Chamber of Commerce and everywhere else. And they can, those multiple perspectives can then pinpoint the problem and agree on that.
Is there an example of one that might, in a common theme in some towns?
I think some of us might start off with, well, we're losing forest, and that's the problem. Well, let's see if we can put a finer point on that and come to an agreement and look at that from a variety of different angles. And so maybe a better way of expressing that problem would be, well, we're facing sprawl development in our rural residential district. I'm just trying to sort of narrow in on
So as far as the problem, that's getting to where is it occurring? What is the pattern of that loss? What is the cause? And it points us to a solution. So that's different than we're losing forest. That's, any number of causes.
Right. And it takes a little bit of the emotion out of it. It's like, okay, it's not just we're losing forest. It's no, we have a specific problem and we can handle that if we name it. Yeah. So let's just take a look at this next video, because that's really going to get us into, we've just identified these community goals. And the next video, we're going to get into, okay, well, how do we shape a future land use map? Having defined a problem, how do we then shape that future map?
Jens, we got no audio.
Thank you, Lincoln. Sorry about that. I got a bunch of stuff going on multiple screens here. Okay, let's try this again.
In the third step, we identified goals and policies that would enable this connected forest condition. In the fourth step, we want to create a future land use map, and that's a required part of the town planning process, which is to really develop a map of what you want where into the future.
We often recommend to towns to think about this map as a conceptual picture of what they want their future to be. So it's not necessarily a representation of what their town is today or what their zoning regulations specify. We ask towns to think about it as a vision for the future. Identify general land use areas and their associated purposes as what you want them to be in the future.
And that's an important piece of this, because it ensures that there's an integration of this pattern of forest blocks and connectors into all of the other goals that we've been planning for, and that it's spatially explicit. Large forest blocks tend to show up there. The connectors in particular don't often show up in the future land use plan. And so you won't actually maintain this forest pattern of blocks and connectors unless it gets into the future land use map. So there's an opportunity here to get beyond large zones and really plan at a more micro level of where forests connect to one another.
It's really beneficial to be able to identify on your future land use map where those forested areas are that we want to be able to maintain into the future, so that then subsequently anything that happens in those areas can be in alignment with what that future vision is. The also necessary part of that future land use map is it basically sets the foundation for any zoning changes into the future.
It gets to be a little bit harder then to decide, well, what are the policies that we'd like to promote? And so we have published community strategies for Vermont's Forest and Wildlife Guide that's full of different regulatory or non-regulatory strategies or policies that towns could consider and then put into their town plan as action steps.
As we think about planning for land use across a whole town, we're trying to engage as many different people and as many different types of people within the town boundary as we possibly can. A great way to do that is through engaging different groups and engaging in partnerships in particular. There's no rule that says it's just a planning commission or just a conservation commission that's responsible for doing the work.
Local partnerships are really good bases of knowledge for what's on the ground, as well as other people who may be in the future able to implement certain actions and put forth policies that your community has developed as part of the planning process. They also are able to be an essential role within the community outreach and engagement and reaching out to a lot of the people who may be underserved in the community.
All plans and all regulations start at the Planning Commission, they end at the Select Board. So Select Boards are going to be important parts of this conversation. So be talking to the Select Board. Figure out what the Select Board is willing to do and not do.
Which actually brings up another important point, how important it is to select things that are actually achievable and to really ensure that the tool that's chosen is doable over a few-year period, that the town has the capacity to make it happen, and then can, in the implementation step, can set people as responsible for making that happen and assign milestones that will allow for that to happen in a reasonable time frame.
There's never like a silver bullet that you invent something. You know, we utilize the mapping and the language in our town plan from earlier days, earlier plans. We made it better. We added bits and pieces to it, and we tried to draw a picture of what was most important. But it wasn't as if, you know, we said, we're going to sit down and just figure this out from scratch. You know, you're always building on what the community's past vision is and where you think it's going in the future.
We have a lot of towns where most of the town is rural residential in terms of a plan. And so it doesn't look any different out here in the big blocks of forest than it looks along the roads if you were to look at their maps. Well, that means that you want people to build out here in the forest just like you want them to build along your roads. And if you don't mean that, make a different map. Make a map that says less out here, more over here. And make a rule that says less out here, more over here. And that way, you don't have to wait until somebody comes along and you go, well, I never thought that that person would sell that lot and then this person would come in. Well, what crazy person would build out there? Well, the person who looked at your rules and plans that said, they'll let me do it.
Much of the forest and the wildlife that is in the forest, they don't adhere to municipal boundaries. So it's really valuable to kind of look beyond those boundaries and see how they could be working with towns to make sure that any policies that they have about protecting forest land will then be kind of compatible with the neighboring towns. So then those policies and goals will actually be able to be implemented on a broader level and have those greater benefits that everybody is hoping for.
Neat. Yeah, there's a lot in that one as well in terms of thinking about this future land use map and how we make clear about what we want where. You know, for me in my world, a lot of what makes things happen in Vermont are local leaders and local movers and shakers. There are always folks on conservation commissions and planning commissions that are just playing an outsized role in their town and helping to bring people together around a common vision. And I'm always struck when I meet new towns to really understand that importance of local leadership. Keith, in your world, do you experience that, these impressive local volunteers?
Oh, there are definitely some champions. Used to be the Chittenden County Forester, and there are folks who were in place for decades and really carried the torch on whether it be the town forest management or the Conservation Commission or some other aspect of environmental stewardship, and they're just such an asset. And I think that support of them by the community, cultivation of their experience, and really just giving them the flexibility to continue to do the great work that they do is really important for their longevity in their roles.
Yeah, I think that last one is a great point as well. And just thinking about, we're not always going to agree with our leaders, and that's fine. We don't always have to agree. But we don't want to torch our leaders either, and just call people out. Keith, you shared with me a newspaper article about calling people in rather than calling people out. I believe that was Wall Street Journal, and I really loved reading that and just understanding that difference of like, how can we build community even with folks we disagree with.
Yeah.
Well, tell you what, I'm just bringing this last video, and then we'll have a few minutes afterwards to talk. So we're at the last step here, and that is implementation. So we've been through identifying the community goals, community values, and then creating that list of goals or policies, and bringing that into the future land use plan. And now we're going to implement. So we're going to choose that tool. So just give me a second to get this next video going.
Is implementation. And here's where we get to enact those goals and policies.
In terms of developing an implementation plan, once you're at that stage in the process, communities can use a combination of regulatory and non-regulatory measures, depending on the sentiment of the community and what works best for them.
On the regulatory side, oftentimes looking at local municipalities, subdivision regulations is a great place to start, to be able to see if their regulations are acknowledging and recognizing the need to be able to look at a subdivision as it relates to the forest, and for the Development Review Board to be able to take into account the value of the forest when people are looking to subdivide their land. On the non-regulatory side, I think this is a place where towns can really be embracing those local relationships. It could be anything from going out and talking to your neighbors about the value of the forest, just starting that conversation and bringing it to the forefront. It can be having education workshops.
There's very strong aspirational goals at the town plan level, especially for communities that have done Act 171 planning, but actually there's quite a bit of lag going from those aspirational goals to then actually having implementable policies through, let's say, the land use, regulatory side.
It's really important for towns to break up a big task like implementing zoning or new subdivision code.
After you've identified the actions that you want to take, you go through and you prioritize them, whether they're high, medium, or low importance, and you associate a time frame with implementation of those. And then you also delegate the task to a certain committee, a certain person, a certain community group, so that they take ownership of it and that they're able to see it through to completion.
The implementation of the municipal plan doesn't have to be all regulatory, and I think there's great opportunity for more non-regulatory actions that towns can be thinking about. This is a place where towns can really be embracing those local relationships. It could be anything from going out and talking to your neighbors about the value of the forest, just starting that conversation and bringing it to the forefront. It can be having education workshops, helping to promote the current use program, talking about property owners, about certain types of management plans they could be implementing, and providing that assistance and linking them with further technical assistance.
The list goes on. And so these are strategies that are really geared towards not necessarily saying to a landowner, hey, X, Y, or Z needs to happen on your property. It's what are your goals for your property? And if you have conservation or stewardship in mind, these are different strategies you can employ.
It's that common finish line that we're all looking to. So it's not about, it's not about how you get there, it's the fact that you get there is what's important.
A great example, the Heinsberg Town Plan has an implementation chapter. They list all the goals and policies that they've included in the plan. They assign responsibility to different parts of the municipal government. They provide a timeline and a sense of the budget. And so that's sort of taking a big ticket item like a zoning or a zoning code or even a particular policy and breaking it up into smaller steps and assigning responsibility is a critical piece here.
I think for communities that are wondering how do we delve into this implementation, if they're feeling a bit, paralyzed, that there are resources available. There's municipal planning grants where they could hire a professional planner then to help them work on one aspect of let's say, their subdivision regulations. They could work with land trusts to actually work with willing landowners in the community who are interested in land conservation. They can work with a county forester who can educate perhaps some new forest landowners who have moved into town, who may own large forest blocks and may not know about the current use program and the advantages that come to enrolling in current use. They can work with a professional planner or Vermont Natural Resources Council or a regional planning commission to actually work on a host of implementation steps. So if a community's not quite sure what the next step is, there are resources available to help them.
Yeah, great. I think Jamie's point there at the end about the resources available to towns to help is a really important one. And really fighting that paralysis, that sense of like, oh gosh, this is so big. What do we do? Keith, any thoughts from your world on like how do we stop that paralysis? How do we get that ball rolling?
The list of things to do is so long. What's the first thing on the list? And that's it. I think it's just take one step, and when that step is taken, there's going to be a next step, and that'll reveal itself. But we don't need to be overwhelmed. There is information available. Take the one step, and then another one is going to emerge. Where most of this work is getting done by volunteers, and the time that's available to do it is the time that's available to do it. So just doing what we can. And it's great to think big, but I think acting small over and over again, will ensure that we're making progress that either we or others can build off in the future.
Yeah, I think that's great. And I just, my last thought is that this is doable. And in fact, towns across Vermont have been doing this, and there's some great examples. When I need a shot of good news, I often go to the Association of Vermont Conservation Commissions. They have this success stories library, and it's just good news. it's just the good stuff that towns have done. And it could be as small as organizing a green up day or as large as a zoning rewrite. But just that sense of like, okay, this is doable, and there are people across the state who have done it, and there are resources to help. I take a lot of, on my darkest days, I really need that kind of shot in the arm. Hey, this has been really fun talking with you, Keith, and we have a couple minutes left. Becky or Ashley, any questions or comments from you two as you've been a part of this conversation and seen these videos? I'll just make a little room. You're welcome to unmute your mics if you'd like, and you certainly don't have to.
Hi, this is Becky. It seems to me that with climate refugees coming to Vermont, potentially, all of this is taking on a greater importance. Do you think that anything needs to be changed in light of this consideration and get in the planning process?
Yeah, we were just, Lincoln and I were just looking at property sales data this morning and saw a 30% increase in 2020 for out-of-state purchases of property in Vermont. So yes, I agree with you, and you know, climate migration is real and it's happening. It's also, you know, it's COVID migration. It's all sorts of things conspiring. And so do I think things need to change? Yes. You know, I think the pace of our actions needs to increase, not just at the local level, but really across the board in response to the climate emergency. Yeah, Keith, last word, feel free.
Yeah, I think that a starting point for that is as folks move in from other parts of the country, they're coming in some cases to be part of the community and to have a voice in the community, and giving them voice and building that community is, I mean, they're there, and I think that the strategies in response to that, there may be some regulatory aspects, but building the community is going to be the foundation for any of those regulatory aspects, any of the non-regulatory strategies. So I think that the first response is build the community, have those events, get people talking. I think that's really important.
Yeah, that's great, Keith. I couldn't agree more with that sentiment. And on that, I think we're going to bring this hour to a close. Folks, thank you so much for joining us. Keith, thank you so much for your insights. It's really fun to have this time to talk with you. And Lincoln, thanks for handling things on the back end. Have a great day, everybody. Take care.
Thank you.
Good to
Thank
meet you.
you.